People should understand too, like, this is really important information. I hope you guys understand. This is really like a college or a graduate school introductory lecture to Islam and geopolitics. And, you don't get this in the West. In American education and the university system, for example, I had a college undergraduate history class on the history of Islam, and it was all just like selling it, it was promoting it. And you don't get this kind of an unfiltered, Kai level approach. So I hope you guys appreciate this and you're getting real information, while we at least have some of the freedom here on YouTube to be able to do it.
We're going to look at what Islam itself teaches about jihad. We're going to look at what is within the Muslim mindset. So even though the non-Muslim agencies will utilize Muslims for their purposes, the Muslims themselves, a lot of the times, actually believe in the teachings of Islam, and they are genuinely wanting to further the advance of Islam. And so it's very important to understand the mindset of Muslims in general. And so I want to focus heavily on the topic of jihad. And this is very important, in my opinion, because there is that oft repeated mantra that Islam is a quote unquote peaceful religion. Muslims will say that, non-Muslim politicians will say that. Everyone wants to convince you that Islam is a peaceful religion, that jihad is just something that is defensive or whatever it may be, but basically to minimize the threat that Islam itself poses at its very core, like what inherently Islam is meant to do in terms of global domination. Jihad means to fight the non-Muslims in order for Islam to become dominant. Islamic legal jurisprudence, or fiqh, states that jihad in the context, specifically with regards to Islam, means fighting, qital, the non-Muslims, al-kufar, in order to support the spread of Islam, linusratil Islam. Now, the phraseology here is quite revealing. The concept of nasr is taken directly from the Quran and refers to the supposed eventual and inevitable dominance of Islam. So, for example, in chapter 110, verses 1 through 2 of the Quran, when Allah secure Nasrullahi and the triumph cometh, and thou seest mankind entering the religion of Allah in troops. So, in other words, Allah will always support the Muslim community or Ummah to wage jihad in order to spread Islam, just as how Muhammad was supported 14 centuries ago. The imagery and connection of Nasr brings comfort to Muslims because in waging jihad, they emulate Muhammad as the Quran indicates they should do, namely in chapter 33, verse 21. Verily, in the messenger of Allah, ye have a good example for him who looketh unto Allah in the last day and remembereth Allah much.
Quick question, Kai. I know this is kind of a basic level question, but we
Sure,
do have a lot of people that may not be familiar with all the ins and outs of Islam. So,
sure.
what is the source in your mind of this idea that Islam does not wage jihad like this anymore? It is only religion of peace. Where do you think that comes from?
So I will talk about that. That is in the presentation. That
Okay.
actually comes from Muhammad's own lifetime. I will talk about it in more detail, but basically, when Muhammad started his ministry, he was in Mecca, he was in the minority, and at that time, fearing any kind of reprisal, he could not engage in any kind of violent behavior or any kind of violent rhetoric. And so that is what's known as the Meccan phase, and I'll talk about it again later in the presentation. But that Meccan phase is where Islam is literally reduced to just peaceful coexistence with your non-Muslim neighbors. you preach to them, but you don't do anything forcible against them. You don't impose yourself on them. You teach them that religion, that Islam is peaceful. And that's where you get statements in the Quran like, to you is your religion and to me is my religion. And if you're a Jew or a Christian, you will still be saved, and you don't have to become a Muslim right now. So it's all of these peaceful like verses in the Quran, but those are within the context when Muslims are in the minority and to avoid getting any kind of reprisal. And so this is the message that Muslims will put forward, that Islam is a peaceful religion. It comes from that, from historically from Muhammad's own lifetime. So continuing on, so this next part, this is literally taken right from this book here in the Mu'tamad of the Shafi'i fiqh. And it's a statement here that is very telling. And it says that jihad is the pinnacle of Islam. Now, this part here, I translated it myself directly. Um, this set, these series, these books that I'm relying on for Islamic law, they are not available in English. So this stuff, I have to translate it myself. But the thrust here is that Islam is inherently violent and oppressive, with its primary purpose being to conquer the world and subjugate everyone under it. So forcible global Islamization is imperative to Islam. And this is what Islamic law is basically saying. It says jihad is the pinnacle of Islam. And those of you who know can read Arabic, you'll read the Arabic terms. And the way that pinnacle, I chose to translate it in that word, but what it literally means, it's like the top most part of the camel's hump, and that's the most important part. So that's the imagery that you're seeing as an Arab speaker when you're reading it. So when you're reading it, this is the context, the way jihad is expressed, the pinnacle of Islam. It is among the most important characteristics of the religion, so much so that some scholars call it the sixth foundational constituent of Islam. So when you're studying Islam, you're taught that you have the testification of faith, the Shahada, that you have prayer or salat, that you have charity, zakat, that you have Saum or fasting, and you have Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. And so those are the kind of like the five pillars of Islam. And what this is saying is that jihad, by a lot of scholars, is kind of considered the sixth foundational constituent of Islam. And its purpose is to be the means by which the spread of Islam is achieved, namely the deliverance of the message of Islam to all mankind, thereby fulfilling what the Most High, i.e., Allah, said in addressing the Messenger of Allah, i.e., Muhammad, by tasking him and his nation, i.e., Muslims after him, and we have not sent you, O Muhammad, except as a mercy to the worlds. And the Most High said, say, O Muhammad, O mankind, indeed, I am the messenger of Allah to you all. So this is basically Islamic scholars recognizing that you've got Quranic verses that establishes Muhammad's message as for all of mankind. And so since Muhammad himself was personally not able to spread that message worldwide or globally, that task now falls on to the Muslims who follow after him generation after generation. That obligation to preach Islam to the entire world is extended to them. They have that obligation. Now, jihad is legislated by the Quran according to Muslim scholars. An example, you have Quran 22:39 that legislates defensive jihad or jihad dafi'. And you also have offensive jihad or jihad talab legislated in the Quran 973, for example. But there are many, many, many verses that legislate jihad. This is just an example. Jihad is also legislated by the Sunnah, according to Muslim scholars. And now the following is a hadith found in both Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. but there are many such hadiths. This is only just one example that I'm citing, and I'm citing it because it's popular for Muslim scholars to cite it themselves, and that's you'll see it cited in these law books. And it says, I have been commanded to fight the people until they testify that there is no deity except Allah and that Muhammad is his messenger, and establish the prayer and pay the charity. And if they do this, then their blood and property are secured except by the rights of Islam, and their accountability is left to Allah. So this is specifically with regards to offensive jihad. Now, I want to mention something highly important with regards to this particular hadith. It is a very well-known tactic by Muslim apologists that whenever they are confronted with a damaging hadith that contradicts their message, they attempt to dismiss it away as if to say it is daif or weak, as if to doubt the contents or its binding nature. The above hadith I just mentioned, and which Muslim scholars themselves mention when discussing the topic of jihad, is found in both Bukhari and Muslim. This is very important. Highlighting this point is something that the Muslim scholars themselves do because such a hadith that is in both Bukhari and Muslim, is termed muttafaqun alayh, or agreed upon. In hadith methodology, this is the highest level of correctness and authenticity that a hadith can have. Such a standard is so highly regarded that stating that a hadith is muttafaqun alayh is proof enough of its authenticity. So Muslims have no way to explain away this hadith and others like it.
By
As
the
for
way,
interpret,
this
yeah,
is Kai. You're the first to be on when I've got my new camera angle here. So this is the Diva angle. This is the official Diva cam.
nice, nice.
Anyway, so it's good to break it up and not have the same image every
Yeah,
single time.
absolutely.
So go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as for interpreting the various Quranic verses calling for jihad, um, because a lot of people who say that Islam is a peaceful religion, they're going to tell you you're interpreting these Quranic verses incorrectly. They don't mean offensive jihad, they mean just defensive. So, like if you get attacked, you have the right to defend yourself. No, you don't. You do, but you have the obligation to wage jihad. So, for example, the one previously mentioned verse 973, O Prophet, strive, Jahid, against the disbelievers and the hypocrites, be harsh with them. And in these books, pick them up right there, Islamic law explicitly comments on not just these types of verses, but this verse specifically, and it clarifies how it is to be understood. That is, in meaning, fight the non-Muslims by the sword, be safe. So those who can read Arabic, that's the Arabic that you will find written in those texts. So in other words, this Quran verse and others like it are to be understood to mean that jihad is to be waged using the sword. Chapter 9 of the Quran is filled with many such verses. Another one is chapter 2, verse 216. All of these verses you're going to see these Islamic law books quote. I'm just giving one example for the sake of brevity on the stream, but numerous verses are given by the scholars to justify offensive jihad, and that you're understanding it by using the sword. Now, there are liars and those uneducated who attempt to twist the meaning of jihad and claim it is merely a private spiritual struggle. They call this jihad of the nafs, or soul. And this understanding has absolutely nothing to do with Islamic law or Sharia. And I'm putting this as for the benefit of the people who encounter this type of argument from Muslim apologists. From a purely legalistic standpoint, by which the Islamic State functions, remember, Islamic law for an Islamic State, nafs refers to the individual in the sense that jihad is personal, as in it is something you personally do, just as how you personally pray, personally fast, personally give charity, personally make the pilgrimage to Mecca, and so on. Jihad is to personally exert effort in helping spread Islam globally, i.e., what you personally do to bring about the global dominance of Islam. Jihad is not some private spiritual struggle that you do in the comfort of your own home. That is known as tazkiyat nafs. Okay, there is a completely separate um, doctrine for this spiritual struggle that you do privately in your own home. It's not jihad, it's something completely different, tazkiyat nafs. Jihad in the context of Islamic law is about Muslims versus non-Muslims. Jihad is obligatory, and there are two terms used in Arabic, wujub and fard. Now, this is going to be a little bit technical, but I just want to mention it. While the Hanafi school of jurisprudence distinguishes the two, the other three schools basically treat wujub and fard as synonymous. But the point here is that jihad is considered an obligation, and Islamic law recognizes two types of obligation, the individual obligation and the communal obligation. The individual obligation, or fard ain, is to wage defensive jihad against non-Muslim invaders. And no one is included from this, no one is excluded from this obligation. All must participate, including women and children. But with regards to communal obligation or fard kifaya, it is to wage offensive jihad against non-Muslims in their own respective lands in order to spread Islam. And it is to be conducted at least once a year with the imam or his representative. It's right in there. But it is not incumbent upon every individual. Only how many individuals as are necessary to have a successful campaign need to participate. Muslims may enter into peace treaties only when the Muslim community is weak. But now here is the kicker. Should Muslims have the upper hand, then Islamic law mandates that they must break the peace treaties and conquer the land. It's explicitly written in the text. If Muslims have the upper hand, meaning that they can wage a successful campaign to take over a land and establish Islamic law, they are legally obligated under Islamic law to do so. They cannot hide behind peace treaties. They must break the peace treaties. So peace treaties are basically used as a way to for the Muslim community to maybe avert aggression by the non-Muslims against the Muslims, stall for time, whatever it is. But there is no honesty at its core when Muslims engage in peace treaties. You need to know that by Islamic law, the Muslim is not engaging in a peace treaty in an honest way. He's only doing it because he can't conquer you. The moment that he can conquer you, then he has the obligation under Islamic law to do so. Now, this is where I'm going to talk a little bit more about the historical example of Muhammad's own lifetime with regards to the so-called peaceful understanding of Islam. So you find it written in the Islamic law books, the way that they describe jihad, they do talk about it as evolving over multiple stages, specifically 4 stages. During the Meccan phase, Muslims coexisted peacefully alongside non-Muslims. Islam was preached in a non-hostile way, and this is jihad of the tongue, meaning to spread Islam through talking. While this manner of spreading Islam is part of jihad, it is restricted to the Meccan phase. Most importantly, however, is that the Meccan phase was when the Muslim community was weak and unable to impose Islam as the law of the land. This reflects Muhammad's initial ministry while in Mecca, where he knew that any overt offensive hostility would lead to severe backlash. Then came the Medinan phase, which consists of three subphases. The Medinan phase starts when Muhammad migrated to Medina to the north of Mecca in order to flee persecution by the Meccans. And this migration is known as the Hijrah. And it's this event that marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. In the first subphase, it was permissible for Muslims to fight, but only by those who were specifically being persecuted and only against those specifically persecuting them. In the second subphase, obligatory defensive fighting was instituted to all Muslims in order to protect the emerging and newly created Islamic State. In the third and final subphase, obligatory offensive fighting was instituted in order to spread Islam. Muhammad conquers Mecca, and the caliphs after him spread Islam across Arabia and North Africa using the sword. So now that Islam is established, it has a stronghold in Medina. The Medinan phase is in full force. Jihad is offensive and it's obligatory. Does Islam teach that it is a peaceful religion? Yes, when the Muslim community is in the Meccan phase. Does Islam teach that it is a violent religion? Yes, when the Muslim community is in the Medinan phase. Understanding Islam hinges on understanding the interplay between the various phases. And remember, Quran 33:21 says that Muslims are to emulate Muhammad's own historical circumstances. So when Muslims preach that Islam is a peaceful religion, what they are really telling you is we are currently in the Meccan phase of jihad against you. That's what it means when they're telling you that Islam is a peaceful religion, that they're too weak to impose Islam on you, that they're currently in the Meccan phase. These are not the opinions of some random scholars. These are the official, relied upon Muhammad positions and understandings of the recognized jurisprudential schools. There is no getting around the fact that violent, offensive jihad is authentic Islam. Overt, offensive, hostile jihad with the intent of global Islamization is the authentic expression of Islam legally mandated by Islamic law. Islamic law for an Islamic state. As a Muslim belonging to an Islamic state, you do not get to make up your own version of Islam. When you, as a Muslim, live in an Islamic state, you live according to Islamic law. It's not any different to how, when you live in whatever country in the world, you live according to the laws of that respective country. You don't get to make up your own law. Likewise, the Muslim nonsense lying about Islam is a so-called peaceful religion. Sure, Islam is peaceful when you're in the Meccan phase, and Islam is also peaceful when you're Muslim living in an Islamic state. But when you do not want to be Muslim, then you have no choice but to abide by Islamic law when living in an Islamic state. And jihad forcibly imposes Islamic society upon everyone. Upon reaching non-Islamic territory, the advancing Muslim army must first invite the non-Muslim inhabitants dwelling there to accept Islam. Should they reject Islam, then they are to be fought. And if they're idolaters, they're to be killed. But if they're what's known as the people of the book, the Ahl al-Kitab, meaning Christians and Jews, then they are to be subjugated. But subjugation, according to Islamic law, means that Muslims are to purposefully humiliate the Christians and Jews. It is not sufficient for the Ahl al-Kitab to merely pay the required jizya, but they must do so in a humiliating way. So when you hear Muslim apologists, they'll say, well, the Muslims, they have to pay zakat, so would they have to give obligatory charity? Well, the non-Muslims, they pay the jizya. It's just the exact same thing. No, it's not the exact same thing. The amount that Muslims will pay is much lower. The amount that non-Muslims pay, the jizya, is much higher. But more importantly, the payment is done in a humiliating way. And that's the point. So Islamic law is very clear on this point. The jizya that non-Muslims pay to the Islamic State, it's not about the money itself. And Islamic law is very clear. It's not about the money. It's about the paying of it done in a humiliating way, meaning in a way demonstrating that Muslims are superior. So it's an example of psychological warfare on non-Muslims. Jihad
That's a
establishes,
great point to keep that in mind, that it's not just getting, monetary advantage. It's psychological warfare and deracination.
yeah, yeah, and that's going to be very, very important with regard to the psychological warfare, especially the one book that I have there that I want to talk about at some point. It's The FBI Agent. He talks about the psychological profile of people who become jihadis and how basically they're psychologically manipulated into the jihadi cause of various groups, whether it's like ISIS, Al Qaeda, and everything. So Islam has within it built a lot of psychological warfare aspects to it. So Jihad also establishes fundamental inequality between Muslims and non-Muslims. For example, in an Islamic state, it is not permissible for non-Muslims to be judges over Muslims or to give testimony against Muslims in a court of law. So your Muslim living in the non-Muslim country that tells you Islam is a peaceful religion, he has no other means but to submit to the law of the land that is now currently in effect, that is not Islamic. And if he was to now become in the majority and establish Islamic law, well, he's going to tell you, we don't have fundamental equality. You cannot be a judge. You cannot witness against me. So basically, it's my word against yours, and the Islamic court will always judge in my favor. It is not permitted for non-Muslims to carry weapons, and non-Muslims must wear distinct clothing to set them apart from Muslims. So these are just some of the things that I listed.
Does that distinct clothing allow you to have drip, or is that a no drip humiliation clothing?
No, you have to still abide by their customs. And you will actually see in regions where Islam was historically prevalent, and that may not be prevalent today. Certain areas, like in Bosnia, for example, that has been under the influence of the Ottomans. So you will see a lot of distinct clothing that even Christians will wear, but that has very much Islamic influence. But it's not exactly the same. It's similar, but it's distinguished in such a way that sets them apart. So it's still abiding by Islamic norms, but it's just setting them apart so that any Muslim can look at that person and say, okay, we know that that is a Jew. We know that that is a Christian. We know that they're not Muslims. And this was mandatory. So the next time you hear a Muslim preacher say that Islam is a peaceful religion, ask him or her, is Islam an equitable religion? Does Islam consider the non-Muslim the same as the Muslim? Are you talking about Islam during the Meccan phase or the Medinan phase? And there are your sources right there. You can just throw that in their face when they lie to you. Islamic law is also very clear that jihad persists until the day of resurrection, Yom al Qiyamah. The Islamic mindset reflects a binary distribution of the world. Dar al-Islam, meaning the region of Islam, the lands that are peaceful because they are under Islamic rule, and the Dar al-Harb, the region of war, meaning the lands that need to be conquered and subjugated under Islamic rule through offensive jihad. So anyone who tells you that Islam is a peaceful religion or that jihad is just a private spiritual struggle, that you engage in the comfort of your own home, is lying to you, is ignorant, and or is delusional. So-called quote unquote moderate Islamic leaders denounce Muslims who engage in violent offensive jihad as extremists and tell us that they do not represent authentic Islam, that they hijacked Islam, that Islam is a peaceful religion. In reality, these so-called moderates are silently waging a stealthy jihad behind the scenes from within society. They are diverting your attention so you do not see the cultural violence they are waging. The moderates are not attempting to assimilate, but rather infiltrate and take over. Both the so-called moderates and extremists work together to bring about the same end result. When discussing jihad, it is inevitable to come across terms such as political Islam, radical Islam, fundamentalist Islam, extremist Islam, used by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. But the term political Islam is misleading because one may think that Islam can either be categorized so as to not consist of any political elements proper, or that Islam is a religion that can be politicized. In fact, Islam is at its very foundation political. There is no aspect of Islam that is not political.
This is important to note because many people in the West assume that these other people groups or these other religions have an enlightenment assumption like we do. This idea that there is a separation between the secular society and the religious elements, and that's not true. So just like in the ancient and medieval world, Christianity believed that there was a governance of the state that applied to theology, that applied to the church. So both were in symphonia, but there is a duty that the state has to God. So it was theocratic. Modern post enlightenment, post scientific revolution, Western civilization has left the idea of theocracy or anything like the state having a duty to God. And now we're faced with a religion with a billion plus people that does believe in theocracy to some extent. And that's precisely why we have to understand that you can't have this idea that they're going to integrate, they're going to assimilate, they're going to uh, jibe with classical libertarian principles. Is preposterous.
Right, right. So, to give an example, so consider this. If you as a Muslim apostatize from Islam, then it is the obligation of the caliph or his deputy or his representative to execute you right here. If you, as a non Muslim, are called to accept Islam and you refuse, then it is the caliph or his deputy who wages war on you and who can impose dhimitude on you, the head tax with corresponding societal subjugation, inferior social status, and explicit social stigmatization. But the caliphate is a religious political institution, and the caliph is a political figure exercising authority for a religious purpose, the dominance of Islam. It's a theocratic institution. And it is very important from the outset not to get caught up in the mindset that one can supposedly divorce Islam from politics. Any attempt to understand geopolitics in the Islamic world and among Muslims at large is to recognize that Islam is a religious system that at its core is inherently political. An extension to this central tenet are also the various connotations associated with the terms mentioned, radical, fundamentalist, extremist, as if to suggest that offensive jihad, especially through violent means, is not an authentic expression of Islam. This kind of thinking is contrary to historical Islam, both in the way it was practiced by Muhammad himself and as well by the succeeding generations of Muslims for the past 14 centuries. In reality, people who are deemed radical or fundamentalist or extremist are in actuality observant Muslims. They are practicing Islam the way it is meant to be practiced. While the overwhelming vast majority of Muslims may confine their religious observances to things like praying, fasting, giving charity, and making the pilgrimage to Mecca, and are otherwise peaceful, the fact that the overwhelming majority do not practice offensive jihad, at least not in an overtly recognizable and physically violent manner, does not negate the validity and obligation to do so. All it means is that the overwhelming majority of Muslims feel that they are still in the Meccan phase, and the so-called extremists are jeopardizing their efforts by prematurely acting out in overt hostility as if they are in the Medinan phase. To help you better contextualize jihad, because at this point it's kind of been a little bit theoretical, just telling you really what jihad is about. Let's contextualize jihad by considering the following thought experiment. I call it the jihad thought experiment. So as I'm reading this, just kind of try to play it in your mind from the vantage point of the narrative. So a Muslim army is approaching to invade and conquer the non-Islamic territory in which you live. For whatever reason, you accept the invitation to Islam and become Muslim, thereby protecting your life once the Muslim conquest is achieved. However, your wife refuses to accept Islam and does not become Muslim with you. Not being knowledgeable in the details of Islamic law, you believe your non-Muslim wife is safe because she is your wife and you're now a Muslim. You might even think of her as your property. It is only after the Muslim conquest that you find out that according to Islamic law, a wife does not automatically follow her husband into Islam. This means that she is part of the spoils of war, specifically under Fay. In other words, an invading Muslim may rightfully claim her for himself as war booty. Now, you, being a good Muslim convert, attend the compulsory Friday congregational prayer. To conclude the prayer, you turn your head to the side and say the compulsory Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you, to the Muslim who is now your wife. That is jihad. That is Islam. That is Islam. Fay booty stems from the Quran itself, and it conveys the general notion of restoration. Everything in the world is for the benefit of Muslims. And anyone who opposes this state of affairs is actually a usurper of the inherent rights of the Muslim community as a whole. Hence, transfer of things and persons to Muslims is restoration of the correct state of affairs. In other words, the Muslim community is to prosper at the expense of non-Muslims. And the transfer reflects this inherent Islamic world order. Let it be very clear. Islamic law does not require there to be compassion for the Muslim convert to retain his non-Muslim wife. Compassion is for the jihadi because Islam promises him non-Muslim women as war booty, even though the husband is a Muslim convert.